Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we are looking at Civil War Generals 2 again. In our last video, I discussed the Peninsula Campaign and the sort of the precursor to the Battle of Seven Pines, which, at least in my opinion, and granted I am no expert, but was one of the key pivotal turning points in the American Civil War. On the map in front of you, or on the video in front of you, I am playing the Battle of Seven Pines. However, it's a historical variant, and I'm not really going to be discussing the gameplay so much as I'm going to be discussing the historical battle. So as I said, in our last video, we really set the stage for the Battle of Seven Pines. We talked about General McClellan's Peninsula campaign, the way he brought his troops in and landed near Fortress Monroe, his advance up the peninsula, his ever so slow advance up the peninsula, his siege of Yorktown, and then being embarrassed as the rebels retreated before him without a major fight, the Battle of Williamsburg and outflanking of further Confederate positions on the peninsula, and the landings near West Point, which allowed him to threaten the rear of the Confederate Army and compel a withdrawal beyond the end of the James Peninsula in Virginia. At the time we left the last video, the Confederate troops had retreated to the borders of Richmond near the suburbs. Cannon fire that would occur could be heard in the capital. I believe the rebels were now about 8 or 9 miles from the city itself with their defensive works. Richmond was nearly invested in a siege, although not quite, and McClellan was preparing for an extended siege, which he believed would bring a Union victory and defeat to the Confederacy and the loss of its capital. However, once again, he was doing things methodically and slowly. He was worried the Confederates outnumbered him, despite this seemingly impossibility of a Union army of over 100,000 men being outnumbered by a Confederacy with a fraction of its population and industry. Somehow, McClellan believed he was outnumbered. It was true that the Confederacy was in the process of mustering the greatest army that they would ever muster, some 80,000 men, which would eclipse even the force that Lee brought north at Gettysburg. It would be the strongest, most well-equipped, most well-prepared Confederate army of the entire war. But we're not yet to that point, because Lee is not yet in command, and that ends up being the key point of the Battle of Seven Pines, the wounding of General Joseph E. Johnston, and the ascension to command of Robert E. Lee of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. But we're not there yet. As I mentioned, at this point in time, the Confederates have pulled back to a defensive line near Richmond. General McClellan and some 108,000 men have marched toward the capital and are now awaiting reinforcements from the Union capital because, again, McClellan is paranoid that he's outnumbered. At this point in time, the line roughly is even with the Chickahominy River, or I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation there, but there's this river that kind of runs north of Richmond and east to west, and tends to swell up and flood during the spring and summer months. At this point, the Union are beginning to establish bridges across this river, and the river is slowly beginning to flood as well. This is a key defensive obstacle at which point the Union will have to overcome. It's the last major geographic obstacle before the city of Richmond itself, and Robert E. Lee has even spoken to the Confederate Congress, stating that they must make a defensive here. They must make a stand here. Lee, who was in charge of kind of the local defenses of Richmond as Jefferson Davis's personal military aide, recognized that this was the last position the Confederacy could withdraw to. In my last video, I did mention that kind of Joseph E. Johnston was compelled to attack by Jefferson Davis. It was not quite so clear as that in reality, so I may have overstated that somewhat. Johnston was continuing to withdraw and told Jefferson Davis, and I quote, that he will be dictated by circumstances, but he would not be explicit about his plans with Jefferson Davis until shortly before the attack. He distrusted Davis. He distrusted civilian political figures, as did General McClellan on the Union side, and so he was very reluctant to share his plans. He wouldn't even really share them with Robert E. Lee, who was becoming more and more involved as his responsibilities for protecting the capital became more and more acute. as the capital grew close. As the capital grew close, Johnston became more and more frustrated with the civilian leadership in the Confederacy and wanted a free hand, although Davis would not give it to him. And eventually, Davis became increasingly nervous and fretting over the lack of Johnston's ability to take an active defense, and this is something that would begin to raise tensions between the two of them. At one point, however, General Joseph E. Johnston realized, I have the moment, I can attack, I can move forward now, and I can defend Richmond. See, Johnston had been retreating up the peninsula at all times, looking for General McClellan to make a mistake. He wanted McClellan to expose a portion of his army so that he could take advantage of that, destroy that portion, and defeat McClellan in detail. The idea of defeating someone in detail means you single, piece by piece, you take apart the enemy army and defeat one at a time. And it's this idea that a smaller army could defeat a much larger army because the smaller army would be presented with only a portion of the enemy's army, and therefore the numerical odds would be somewhat evened and allow the smaller army to obtain a victory. And then with that victory, the main enemy army would be so reduced in strength, because it's now missing this portion, that the smaller army could, assuming it obtained a decisive and disproportionate defeat, would then be able to take on the main body of the force. This was actually the same rationale that the Germans operated with during World War I with their Navy. The idea was to lure the Royal Navy into a trap where a portion of the British Navy would be isolated and destroyed, and then the rest of the Royal Navy could be engaged on near equal terms with what was left of the German fleet and what was left of the British fleet. So this was sort of Johnston's idea, but the problem with it was McClellan was very deliberate and very slow. In that sense, McClellan didn't lead himself to being defeated in detail because he kept his army so concentrated and so together that it was unlikely at any point that he would end up falling into such a trap. And that was Johnston's dilemma as he continued to retreat up the peninsula. However, by the time he reached Richmond, both nature and geography ended up coming to Johnston's aid to provide this opportunity to attack, an opportunity that Johnston recognized, okay, listen, finally I can go ahead and attack. Even though I'm heavily outnumbered on the whole, at this point I can obtain a limited a local numerical superiority and attempt to defeat the Union in detail. So he announced his plans to attack. These announcements were met with tremendous relief on Jefferson Davis's part, who again had been growing increasingly combative with Johnston, increasingly frustrated with the lack of active defensive measures, and Robert E. Lee also was assuaged by this. Lee had sort of begun to act as a intermediary between Davis and Johnston to try and allow them to kind of cooperate. A couple of times Johnston, when becoming frustrated with the political situation, Lee would assuage his concerns and kind of act as almost like a coach or fatherly figure. This was one of Lee's great talents, but we will get into that at a later time. Lee had many great talents. That's not so much relevant to here. So what happened? What did McClellan do that allowed him to be attacked and at least Johnston believed defeated in detail? Well, I mentioned the Chickahominy River, and again, I apologize for the pronunciation. This river that runs somewhat north and east of Richmond. It was a geographical barrier that the Union had to cross in order to attack Richmond, and they began crossing it in late May. However, heavy rains and, I believe, flooding further up the river ended up causing the river to swell its banks. So the Union did have bridges over this river, but it was only a portion of the Union Army that had crossed the river. In late May, the Union Army was laid out as follows along the Chickahominy River. The Union right, which was closer to Mechanicsville and somewhat north of Richmond, or at least northeast of Richmond, started with General Fitzjohn Porter's corps. To his left was Franklin's corps, and then further down the river was Sumner's corps. These three corps were all north of the swollen and flooded Chickahominy River. To the south of the river, near Fair Oaks and Seven Pines, were General Keyes and General Heintzelman. McClellan's 108,000 men were divided into 5 corps. There were more corps in the army, one of them being General McDowell's corps up near Manassas on the old Manassas battlefield. That was not transferred to the peninsula. It was acting as a shield in front of Washington, but it was some 38,000 men that General McClellan badly wanted. McClellan was anticipating McDowell to march south in late May, and indeed Lincoln had told him he would have these 38,000 men. But General Jackson intervened. A stunning and devastating campaign in the Valley routed 3 separate Union armies in the Valley, and a small force under General Jackson therefore threatened Washington. It was unlikely they would pose any serious threat due to their small size and the fact that Washington was a very heavily fortified town, but nonetheless the political pressures on Lincoln prevented him from moving McDowell south. At the time, General Johnston had decided to attack the northern bank of the Chickahominy River with the 3 out of 5 Union corps. He had some 53,000 men to his disposal, and the rationale for the attack was that an attack north would not expose Richmond to a direct Union assault. The fear was that if they had attacked the Union corps to the south of the river, they'd be advancing west to east, and then would end up uncovering Richmond for an advance by the Northern Union Corps to swoop down on Richmond unopposed, whereas an attack south to north would not inherently expose the capital to the Union troops to the east, and the attack there would not risk McDowell coming down north into an unopposed Richmond, which would have been the case if the army had moved west to east. McDowell could have moved south from Manassas again into a unprotected Richmond. So the decision had originally been to attack the 3 Union corps to the north of the river. This was the more numerous portion of the army, but it was the safer avenue of advance. However, the Union defeat in the Valley and Lincoln's decision not to move McDowell south allowed Johnston to reconsider. He actually canceled his attack, much to President Davis's consternation, without telling the president, and the president rode out wondering on the day the battle was supposed to occur why there was no firing going on. When he met Johnston, he had been informed that Johnston was no longer going to attack north, rather he was going to attack the Union corps to the south of the river, namely Keyes and Heintzelman. The thought was since it was only 2 out of 5 Union corps, they'd be able to more easily isolate and destroy, and the attack would occur with General Huger, D.H. Hill, and Longstreet's divisions, more than 3/5 of the Confederate Army against only 2/5 of the Union Army. The thought was they'd drive them up against the river and defeat them. Now, McClellan, in his ever-cautious manner, had built some pontoon bridges which would come into play. These bridges were being increasingly put under pressure by the rising tide of the flooded Chickahominy River, but at the time the Battle of Seven Pines occurred, the Union Army was tentatively linked by these pontoon bridges, which in theory could allow the Union to shift reinforcements south of the river should the southern portion of the army be isolated and attacked. McClellan was uncomfortable with his army being split by 2 rivers, and he felt that he had too many columns in place. He felt that his army was not concentrated enough, and he did express this concern to Washington. However, the army was laid out in this manner to protect General McDowell's advance south from Manassas, rather than everyone being east of Richmond. That occupying the northern bank would protect McDowell's advance toward linking up with the army, and he had received instructions from Washington to array himself in such a manner to threaten both flanks of Richmond. He wasn't happy about it, but he had to live with it. At this point, I'm going to take some liberties to quote from Shelby Foote's Narrative History of the American Civil War, his Fort Sumter to Perryville, Volume 1 of the Civil War, because I think he describes it in much more effective ways than I can in terms of the debacle that ensued. So as I said, General Longstreet, Hill, and Huger were all going to be launching this attack, those 3 Confederate divisions, while General Magruder and General A.P. Hill would end up staying and guarding against the 3 Union corps to the north and protecting the Confederate left. So I'm going to go ahead and quote kind of the preamble to the battle that he lays out. Again, these 3 corps are advancing west to east from Richmond toward Keyes and Heintzelman's corps, which are on the southern half of the Chickahominy River, just east of the city of Richmond. Here's what Shelby Foote writes. The most remarkable thing about the ensuing action was that a plan as sound as Johnston's appeared at the outset, so simple and forthright, indeed as to be practically foolproof, even for green troops under green commanders, could produce such an utter brouhaha, such a Donnybrook of a battle. Seven Pines, or Fair Oaks as some called it, was unquestionably the worst conducted large-scale conflict in a war that afforded many rivals for that distinction. What it came to, finally, was a military nightmare, not so much because of the suffering and bloodshed, though there was plenty of both before it was over, but rather because of the confusion compounded by delay. Longstreet began it, since his assigned route over the 9-mile road would put him under Smith, who outranked him. He persuaded Johnston to give him command of the force on the right. As next-ranking man, he was entitled to it, he said, and Johnston generally agreed, on condition that control would revert to him when the troops converged on Seven Pines. Longstreet, thus encouraged, decided to transfer his division to the Williamsburg Road, which would give an unhampered freedom from Smith and add to the weight of D.H. Hill's assault on the Union center. He did not inform Johnston of this decision, however, and that was where the trouble first began. Marching south on the outskirts of Richmond, across the mouth of the 9-mile road, he held up Smith's lead elements, while his 6 brigades of infantry trudged past with all their guns and wagons. This in itself amounted to a considerable delay, but Longstreet was no means through. When Huger prepared to enter the Williamsburg Road, which led to his assigned route down the Charles City Road, he found Longstreet's 14,000-men division to his front, passing single file over an improvised bridge across the swollen creek. Nor would the officers in charge of the column yield the right of way. First come, first serve, they said. When Huger protested, Longstreet informed him that he ranked him. They stood there in the morning sunlight, the South Carolina aristocrat and the broad, hairy Georgian, and that was the making of one career and the wrecking of another. Huger accepted the claim as true, though it was not, and bided his time, while Longstreet took the lead. The morning sun climbed up the sky, and now it was Johnston's turn to listen, as Davis had done 2 days ago, for the boom of guns that remained silent. As he waited with Smith, whose 5 brigades were in position 2 miles short of Fair Oak Station, his anxiety increased by the fact that he had lost one of his divisions as completely as if it had marched unobserved into quicksand. Nobody at headquarters knew where Longstreet was, nor any of his men, and when a staff officer galloped down the 9-mile road to find him, he stumbled into the enemy lines and was captured. When at last Longstreet and his troops were found, they were halted beside the Williamsburg Road, 2 miles out of Richmond, while Huger's division filed past to enter the Charles City Road. Johnston, who could only presume that Longstreet had misinterpreted last night's verbal orders, the delay could be ruinous. Everything depended on the action being completed before nightfall. If it went past that, McClellan would bring up reinforcements under cover of darkness and counterattack with superior numbers in the morning. As the sun went past the overhead, Johnston remarked that he wished his army was back in its suburban camps, and the thing had never begun. He could no more stop it, however, than he had to get it started. All he could do was wait, and the waiting continued. Lee rode out from Richmond, determined not to spend another day like the office-bound day of Manassas. Johnston greeted him courteously, but spared him the details of the mix-up. Presently there came from the southeast an intermittent, far-sounding rumble of cannon. It grew until just after 3 o'clock, with 10 of the 15 hours of daylight gone. The rumble was vaguely intensified by a sound that Lee believed was musketry. No, Johnston told him, it was only an artillery duel. Lee did not insist, although it seemed to him that the subdued accompaniment was rising in volume. Then, at 4 o'clock, a note came from Longstreet informing the army commander that he was heavily engaged in front of Seven Pines and wanted support on his left. That was the signal Johnston had been awaiting, ordering Smith's lead division to continue down the 9-mile road until it struck the Federal right. He spurred ahead to study the situation firsthand. As he rode off, the president rode up, so that some observers later said the general had left in haste to avoid an irksome meeting. So that's how Shelby Foote describes the preliminary piece of Seven Pines, and that's really the important piece. I mean, Seven Pines is a complex battle which takes place over 2 days, but with that being said, it was largely defined by the poor communication and mix-ups of the early hours of the battle, the poor alignment of the army and the inability of the army to get in to position in a timely manner that hindered the success of the forthcoming attack. One side note, earlier in the video I mentioned that D.H. Hill, Huger, and Longstreet were the three divisions attacking. The Confederates also had a division under Smith, as you'd guess from that little bit of reading that I just did. Also, in case you're unfamiliar with Shelby Foote's 3-volume History of the Civil War, which I just quoted from, I will include a affiliate link in the description to talk about if you're interested in checking that out. With all of that said, the real story of Seven Pines was the preliminary mix-ups between the divisions and the unclear marching orders. Johnston allowed too much freedom of movement between his division commanders, and a better chain of command at a corps level probably would have been beneficial. As you saw it, division commanders vying for the ability to control their own actions may have been better reined in by a corps system, which would have allowed Johnston to better organize his force. This would eventually occur with the Army of Northern Virginia, but not quite yet. The battle erupted on May 31st when General D.H. Hill struck the Union left. General Keyes' corps and Heintzelman's corps were struck. General Casey, General Kearns, these division commanders were attacked, and Hill successfully flanked and drove them back for the majority of the afternoon. Smith then went in and attacked as well, driving the Union forces in front of them. The Union were pushed back somewhat substantially. It looked as if Johnston was obtaining some success. However, and this battle can be summed up largely by that failed marching and that delayed attack, because dusk was rapidly approaching. The Union were being driven back. They were being driven back pretty easily, and the Confederates were seeing some success, with Kearny and Casey being outflanked, Couch being pushed back. Keyes and Heintzelman's corps were in trouble. However, the key moment came in the afternoon of May 31st, when General Sumner's 2nd Corps was ordered to cross the Chickahominy River and support the Union forces on the southern bank. He was told by the sort of individuals in charge of the bridge that this wasn't possible, that the river could not be forded, that it was too flooded, and the bridges over would not hold. However, they did, and Sumner moved Sedgwick's division across the river to the support of the Union, who were being outflanked and driven back. This was the key moment. The Confederates still were somewhat successful through the remainder of May 31st, but nightfall ended up preventing them from obtaining a substantial victory. And at some time during the dusk hours of the night, or early hours of the night, General Johnston was wounded by a random musket ball. This removed the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia and would end up leading to the assumption of command under Robert E. Lee, which we'll talk more about in a later video. This was the key moment of the battle, not because it would have been successful if it hadn't occurred, but because it changed the course of the war in the Eastern Theater going forward. With that being said, despite their commander's wound, the Confederate armies continued their attack on June 1st, the very next day, although they now met with General Sumner's corps, which had been brought up, General Heintzelman, and General Keyes, all in strong positions, and they were unsuccessful in driving the Union back further. The Confederate attacks on June 1st were not going anywhere. The Union launched a few counterattacks and drove back Longstreet and Huger's divisions, and by 11:30 the next morning, the Confederates withdrew. It was claimed as a victory by both sides. The Confederates had pushed back a Union force to their front. It was the second major engagement in the Eastern Theater. Some 6,000 Confederates were casualties and 5,000 Union were casualties. The Confederates had successfully attacked on May 31st, but had been stymied on June 1st, and both sides claimed victory. It's worth noting that General McClellan was on his sickbed for the majority of the battle, and the battle was largely conducted by his subordinates. In addition, General Oliver Howard had his arm shattered by a mini-ball and would end up losing his arm to amputation, just worth calling out as he becomes a major figure in later battles. But that's really the Battle of Seven Pines. The story really comes down to mismanagement and ineffective marching across the battlefield. The fighting itself is incidental. The Confederates had an advantage on May 31st and pushed the Union back. The Union rushed reinforcements across a swollen river, which was not quite as impassable as the Confederates had thought, and were able to stop the Confederates cold on the second day of the battle and then eventually drive them back. Some of the details here and there, if they're inaccurate, please point them out. But this is the general flow of the battle, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video, as that more or less concludes my discussion. Now, this particular video obviously saw me win the Battle of Seven Pines somewhat easily, and I guess you could say it was somewhat historical. The Confederates had early success, and my later success reversed that. But that's going to be the end of this video. The next video will look at the beginning of the 7 days battles, so I hope you guys enjoyed, and until next time, I'm out.